An EgyptAir Airbus A320 that was flying over the Mediterranean Sea very early in the morning on May 19, 2016, seemed to have vanished. The lives of 66 people are disappearing with the plane. A lot of unknowns have been surrounding this plane crash for a long time, with little information being made public in the years following. A trend that is still going strong today. But in the last few months, new information came to light. And now we know why this plane crashed and where the disaster began. This is the story of Flight 804 of EgyptAir.
Breaking developments in the mystery of EgyptAir Flight 804.
Relatives and friends of the passengers who boarded EgyptAir 804 descend on the airline's counter.
66 passengers and crew on board, 3 of them children.
Caused the plane to crash into the Mediterranean Sea.
What caused that passenger plane to crash?
EgyptAir 804.
EgyptAir Flight 804.
EgyptAir Flight 804.
First, some background. Egypt Flight 804 went from Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport to Cairo, Egypt at night. EgyptAir's safety record has been all over the place in the past. In the years before Flight 804, the airline had done some things to make that better. For one thing, the fleet was brought up to date because the airline uses the very famous Airbus A320 planes. The Airbus A320 is one of the most flew planes right now on many of its shorter foreign routes, such as the one to Paris. Some of the most cutting-edge technology ever seen on an airplane is built into it. This plane is liked by both pilots and passengers because the flying controls are automated and the comfort of the passengers depends on the airline. This Airbus A320 took off from Paris just after 11 p.m. on May 18, 2016. And was due to arrive in Cairo just after 3 a.m. Nothing went wrong during the first 2 hours of the trip. As usual, the pilots were talking to a lot of air traffic managers. The flight took place at night as usual, and the sky was mostly clear over Southeast Europe. At that time, it was quiet on the flight deck, and the 36-year-old captain was there with the younger first officer, Mohammed Ahmed Mamadou Hassan. There were a lot of flight hours on this team, even though they were young. This suggests that they were skilled pilots. Captain Chowker had more than 6,000 hours of flight time, while the first officer only had 2,700 hours by the time of the crash. The pilots looked tired because they had been working long hours. It is said that yawns could be heard on the pilot voice recorder to back this up. 5 more members of the cabin crew worked to help the 56 people who were in the cabin, along with 3 more EgyptAir workers. There were 66 people on board, and they were flying at 37,000 feet. At just before 12:30 in the morning, the pilots checked in with Greek air traffic control. Just a quick thing to remember. The time stamps that are moving forward are based on the time in Athens and Cairo. Flight 804 flew southeast and over Athens, the city of Greece. It then flew over the Aegean Sea, flying east of islands like Santorini and Crete. It then flew over the small Greek island of Kosmose and out over the open sea between Europe and Africa. During the next accident, there was no contact between the pilots and air traffic control. Radar data that was found showed that the plane disappeared about halfway over the water at 2:30 without sending a distress signal or making any other kind of contact. 60 people were killed when the plane crashed into the Mediterranean Sea. It was about a month before the wreckage was found. It mostly stayed at the bottom of the water. It was clear that people wanted to know what happened to the plane. These days, it's already very uncommon for a passenger plane to crash. But for something like this, with this plane, people wanted to know more. The key to making things more shocking in the media didn't help. There was talk of possible terrorist action. 3 months before, someone took over another EgyptAir A320 on a domestic trip between Alexandria and Cairo. It landed in Cyprus on October 31, 2015. 92 people were killed when a Russian passenger plane was bombed just minutes after taking off from Sharm el-Sheikh the year before. Because of this, people started to wonder about the safety of not only EgyptAir, but also air travel in Egypt in general. As a result, several airlines and 2 operators briefly stopped flying to and from Egypt after the Metrojet incident. At this point, it should be said that Flight 804's crash was not planned. It was an accident, and a pretty strange one at that. So let's go back and look at what we know about the last few minutes of the flight. And the plane's found flight data would be a good place to begin. The plane was no longer seen on radar, but it hadn't broken up in the air. The bird kept going. In the last 3 minutes of the trip, the plane turned 90 degrees to the left and then 360 degrees to the right. When the Greek government first made this information public, some people in Egypt didn't agree with it. The plane started going down during the turns and kept going down until the signal was lost at about 10,000 feet. It went twirling into the water. What else did we know at the start, though? Since that doesn't tell us much, we can start to understand what was going on during the disaster by looking at the signs sent by the plane's ecosystem. Aircraft communication is a piece of equipment that modern passenger planes have. It's a way to handle and report problems. For short, it's called a course. A flight information system automatically sends small bits of information about a trip and plane back to the ground. These messages are often helpful, like when there's a maintenance to do. So when officials got the information from EgyptAir's records, what they found was very strong. In the morning, between 2:26 and 2:29 of those messages were sent. Several reports that said there was smoke suggest that there was a fire on board. It turned out that what people thought about the fire was true. The data was compared to the found flight data recorder, which also showed smoke in the area that used to be the toilet and the avionics bay below the cockpit. This really made us wonder more than it answered. On a passenger plane, fires don't start for no reason. Some people even said that this new information was more proof that there was a bomb on board. But the questions about where the fire came from stayed in the realm of imagination. The Egyptian investigation seemed to show that there wasn't much talking going on between Egyptian investigators and people in the foreign aviation community. Where did that fire come from? Let's talk about fire. We all learned in science class that for a fire to spread, it needs 3 things: fuel, air, and heat. Go ahead and look at air for now. It was found that there was an air leak on the side of the first officer, mask and source of oxygen. A few days before the accident on May 16, the plant was being fixed up, and the first officer's breathing mask was being changed. The machine was put into emergency mode so that maintenance workers could test it. According to a paper from Airbus, an oxygen leak could happen in this mode. The oxygen for the pilots is stored in a high-pressure tank on the lower side of the captain. A set of valves and buttons let pilots control the flow of oxygen. If necessary, they can turn off the supply. Airbus says that emergency mode causes too much pressure. People use it to get rid of the mask of mist and keep smoke, ash, and bad smells from building up. A knob on the oxygen system can make the oxygen flow stay too high all the time. It's thought that there was an oxygen leak here because repair workers left the first officer's oxygen system in emergency mode. It had been 3 days. What else was wrong with the plane? In any case, it might be interesting to note as a side point. Several reports say the plane that crashed was a Sierra Uniform Golf Charlie. Charlie was having computer issues on May 18th, which started in the late evening of May 17th. Going to Asmara in Eritrea, the plane went. It came back to Cairo early in the morning of May 18th. After that, there was a trip back to Tunis. The trip to Paris started in the evening of May 18th, and the accident happened early the next morning, May 19th. On 3 of these trips, planes had to make emergency landings. The Accord system sent out information that made the returns possible soon after the plane took off. However, after being checked out, the plane was still allowed to fly on these times. The gas leak wouldn't have been enough to start the fire that burned down the plane by itself. This is where the most puzzling part of this disaster might come into play. There was evidence in the plane's records that a certain plug had been changed in the cockpit 2 months before the crash. It turned out to be a trash can for cigarettes after more research. The fact that EgyptAir let their pilots smoke in the cockpit is shocking. The company wouldn't ban this until after the crash. To tell you, this happened in 2016. In 2018, international investigators started their own probe in France. They have now pointed to the pilots who were smoking when the fire started. We know that a loss of oxygen can be very bad. When Flight 592 of ValueJet went down in 1996, the investigation found that the fire started by an oxygen leak caused by bad cargo management and storing a lot of oxygen containers with the wrong labels. At least one of these tanks turned on and began giving off oxygen. It also seemed like the bins themselves gave off a lot of heat. All of this led to a terrible plane crash that killed 110 people. The fire that killed everyone on EgyptAir Flight 804 is now thought to have been caused by a lit cigarette and an air leak. A microphone inside the oxygen mask picked up a lot of noises and hissing at around 225 kilohertz on the cockpit voice tape. The fire would spread to the forward toilet in the next minute. That's where this air-caused message was sent at 2:26 minutes later. We know that the fire, or at least smoke, got into the area under the cabin where the electronics are kept. After 2 minutes, at 2:27, the plane sent out a message about the reason. The plane was found to have other problems as well. Among these were fault and the flight control unit that handles the autopilot and other fly-by-wire functions, as well as another set of flight controls that were recorded at 2:29 and 2:36. It was reported that the plane's emergency locator transmitter sent its first message, or LTE for short. It's supposed to sound an alarm when the plane crashes, which makes it easier to believe that the pilots only had minutes to do their job. There were 66 people on EgyptAir Flight 804 when it crashed into the Mediterranean Sea. The pilots lost control of the plane. People have said bad things about the Egyptian government. Egypt did the study, but they didn't even give us a free preliminary report. Reports say that Egyptian investigators also stopped talking to foreign investigators. This led to another investigation that led to the results we know today. Pilots at EgyptAir can no longer smoke on their planes. Some people now think that EgyptAir's choice to tell its pilots they can't do that questionable habit shows that Egyptian investigators came to the same conclusion about the fire, but didn't say anything. There is, however, only talk about that. At this point, EgyptAir's most recent accident was Flight 804. Let's hope that stays the case.